Hello and welcome to lecture 35, where I'll be showing you how to set up proper render settings for noise-free renders. Continuing where we left off in the previous lecture, we will jump right into our render settings. So we set up AOV, so the next thing is to hit the Arnold Renderer tab, where you have a few sliders which we need to set up to control our renders. So an important thing is these AA samples is the main slider which will control your render times. So having a high number here defines your amount of render time more or less. So the higher this number, the longer you render, the lower, the faster. So this is kind of something to think of. Importantly is your lights are also affected by this. So the samples in here are also playing a role in the overall samples. And to not undersample your renders, what I tend to do most of the time is have light samples of 2 for each of these lights. Currently they were all set to 1, which is alright, but it might have an undersampled look to it. So what I tend to do for all my lights is to have a light samples of 2. So how it works is camera AA samples are multiplied by itself, so it's 4 times 4 is 16, and then this number is multiplied by the same as in the AA samples. So the AA samples in here are also multiplied by itself, so it's 4 actually, and then it's 16 times 4, right? So this is how it's calculated and how many samples are being shaded. So this is something to keep in mind. And a general rule of thumb is to only play with the AA samples, and then if it's still noisy, slowly bring in these guys. So diffuse means it is the indirect diffuse which might be noisy. So if I go to my diffuse indirect and this pass is noisy, to get it cleaner is by increasing these samples here. And the same for the specular. So if I go to specular indirect and it is noisy here, then you would increase the specular samples. Same for transmission, same for scattering, same for volumes. The camera AA only controls the direct passes. So if I go to code direct and it's clean, it's fine. If I go to diffuse direct and it's clean, it's fine. As you can see, this one is not really clean. So here's a few things to fix all that. So let's just render or select this region and actually render. And keep in mind, we also have depth of field on. So also that plays an interesting role by to set proper samples. So I just want to enable our render tile so we can actually see something going on. So I know when the render is done. So you can see that the background is or should be blurred. I think it's still on. If I check my render camera and just check if depth of field is on, it is on with an aperture of 1. If I put it to 5, yeah, it's definitely blurring the background. So let's just keep it on a value of 1. And to fully denoise your images, make sure you are on your final render settings. So let's just go up to 100%. And just frame this area here, and this is now our final resolution, right? So just based on that, you can see that it is still noisy. And if I go to my diffuse direct pass, you can see it is very noisy, and also just overall the beauty is noisy too. So the first thing what I would do is, if you want to go for final settings, just play up the AA samples, maybe up to 6. And depending how strong your depth of field is, you need to increase this value some more. So let's just check if our code is a bit cleaner now. And the diffuse direct is a lot cleaner. And on the car pane, it's a bit different because the shader is different and it samples differently as well. So if I just render the bottom region here, you can see that the base shadow should be fairly clean. Let's see, so this is very clean in the diffuse direct, so this is a good sign. So let's just maybe render this section here and see what we get if I just go over to the diffuse indirect. or let's just render this with the diffuse indirect and see if this is clean. And this looks like there's almost no noise, which is good. We can see some slight noise here, but for now we can just leave it at 1. So it's 6.1, which we have now. So let's head over to the specular tab or specular AOV and check the direct spec. And you can see it is still a bit noisy, but it might also just be the flake. So let's just check a different area. And I think it is okay. If we check 100 resolution, there is still some noise going on. So let's just bump the camera AA maybe to 8 and see if it gets better. Yeah, just by doing that, we can see we got rid of a lot of noise right there. And just the car in general looks also a lot cleaner now. Alright, so this is the typical process. You check each AOV and see if you can get rid of the samples. So let's jump to the specular indirect tab. And you can see now here is actually still some noise going on. And obviously to get rid of that, we would need to boost our specular samples. So maybe let's just try something like 2 to get rid of the noise. You can see there's something going on, it's noisy there. So let's just maybe try 2. So now you can already see that it is going really, like the render times go up pretty fast, like 8 times 8, 64, 64 times 4. So you can see how it adds up. It goes up pretty quick. And you can see samples is 256 already for our specular indirects. Now let's see what our beauty looks like, if it's clean or if it's noisy. Just by doing this, so 812 for our render settings, we have a pretty decent image. You can see there's the flakes are working. So this is noise which is intentional, which is coming from our flakes. So let's see what we can do here, if this is actually clean. I'm just checking problematic areas which might have some noise. And especially like reflections and really high glossy parts might get noisy, but I think even this is super clean. Let's just render the background a bit, so see if we can get rid of this noise. And yes, it's a bit noisy, but I think we can live with that because our main focus is the vehicle, so we should be good. And as you can see, it was pretty easy to set up these settings. An important thing to keep in mind is to really slowly increase these values and not try something. If I just stop the render quickly and not try something like 8, 8 or 8, this would be insane. It will render forever. So a general rule of thumb is if your AA samples are higher than 6, diffuse and spec should not really go higher than 2. And whatever is higher than 6, so if it's maybe 8 or even a lot higher, your diffuse and specs should most of the time just be on 1. SSS is a bit different, but it should not be on 3. It should maximal be up to 2 for if you have an AA sample of 8. So you might think, when are you using such high values? One aspect is if you have motion blur and fast objects moving, you get really long streaks of motion, and then your camera A samples need to be very high to clean it up. So sometimes for this, I have seen renders which are up to 18, 1111 and stuff like that. So things like that do happen. So then it's very important, if you have 18 AA samples, be sure your light samples are also set to 1. Yeah, so for final settings, I think we're at 8 to 2 or 1 2. So this is something we can render now. Another thing is, which they have introduced recently, is adaptive sampling, which is very interesting because how it works is you can set your minimum AA samples which you want to render. Let's say I want to say my minimum which each pixel should get is 3 AA samples. But then you can enable adaptive sampling and tell Arnold that your maximum AA samples should maybe be 10. So now you can also see that our samples on the top have changed from max to 45 to 500 or 18 to 200. And this is, the threshold is controlled by this adaptive slider. So the lower this gets, the higher your final render settings will be, or the more closer your samples will go to 10. So if it's a value which is very high, it will not go higher than 10, and it will be more closer to AA samples of 3, 4, 5, but it will not go lower than 3. So to see that in an example, currently it is enabled. For adaptive sampling to work properly, make sure your progressive refinement is off, and you just render for now a region which is a bit problematic, like maybe this section at the bottom here. So you can already see just by doing this, we actually get a pretty decent render out of the box by just having a adaptive threshold of 0.1 and a max AA samples of 10. And you can see the render is progressing. We have some noise in the number plate, but all in all, it's actually a very good result. And you can see if I compare this to maybe this side here, we can see we have some noise, but it is already very clean, which is cool. And obviously what you can do to speed up your renders, you can have a high threshold, maybe of 1, and you can see now it resolves a lot faster. So this is how adaptive sampling works. And if you want to have, if you don't really want to care about this stuff, you can actually also put this to 1 and maybe to 2. So leave it as that. And then in the end, all you got to do is play up the, or lower the threshold. So I can show you how that works. So we can actually go up with the AA samples, maybe up to 12, which should not change the render so far because our threshold is very high. So if I reduce the threshold to B.2, you can now see that our renders should get a lot cleaner by increased render times. And Arnold is so clever to know when to use which samples and how to sample things better and more efficient. So the lower the more you lower the threshold, the better your renders will be, or the longer it will take, but the cleaner they will be. How clean it gets just by doing this. And obviously render times go up, but as I said, it's your renders get really clean, and you can see now how almost noise free this whole image is. And if I render the background, let's see what we get here. You can see it's pretty good. We can, if you still see noise, what you can do, you can force more diffuse samples, and this is overall increasing our decreasing the noise. And you can see now it's very clean just by doing that. And you can also put both to 2. So this is kind of forcing a minimum quality, which is sometimes a good thing to do. So 2 to 2, and then just play around with the adaptive threshold is something you can play with. And now you can see just by setting up a render settings of 2 to 2 and then a adaptive sampling up to 12 and a threshold of 0.05, we get a very clean render. If you just check this region, it's very clean. That's all you gotta do to set up your render settings. But before we finish this lecture, I just want to quickly touch up on ray depth. In the previous lecture, I talked about diffuse and specular depth. So for final renders, it's always good to have at least 2 bounces in spec and in diffuse. So just keep that in mind. A value of 1, your renders get really dark in the bounce, in the indirect passes. So keep these things up, especially if you have interior renders. Diffuse should go up really high, but for this render, it's totally fine. And then depending on your software you're using, you just kick off a render and your IOVs will be output to separate folders. And then you can have some play in compositing land. So now you can see the finished render with pretty high samples, and it took a while to render. It's 11 minutes, but it's a super clean render. So I hope this lecture showed you the ways of working with render samples, how to get clean renders. And just to recap what we did in this section, we worked on the camera. I showed you how to set up depth of field for your renders, to work with bokeh. And the next step was to create output variables for your compositing software like Code, like Specular or Diffuse. And then as a final lecture, we worked on the render settings with AA samples, indirect samples, light samples, to give you noise-free renders for your compositing later on. So I hope in the future you will be able to output very cool looking renders with optimized shaders, lights, and obviously good looking renders with good render settings, noise-free images, and obviously something very creative. So I hope this lecture and section gave you all that you need for your future endeavors in Arnold. Thank you guys for watching this.